He was Richard Sterling, a titan of industry, a man who built an empire from scratch. She was Clara, his elegant, perfect, and utterly silent wife. After 25 years, he decided to trade her in for a younger model. When he filed for divorce to marry his mistress, he offered Clara a generous settlement to thank her for her loyalty. But when they walked into that courtroom, his high-powered lawyers discovered a terrifying secret she had kept for 2 decades. She didn't just own half of his empire. She owned it all. This is the story of how a man who thought he was king discovered he was only a guest in his own castle. Richard Sterling didn't just walk into a room. He conquered it. At 58, he was the picture of arrogant success, with a sharp Italian suit stretched over a frame kept hard by merciless morning workouts, and a head of silver hair that business magazines called distinguished. He was the CEO and founder of Sterling Ventures, a private equity firm that ate struggling companies for breakfast and spat out multi-million-dollar profits by lunch. His life was a curated masterpiece of power. The 3-story penthouse overlooking Central Park, the Gulfstream G-Sanct 50 waiting on the tarmac, the whispers of Mr. Sterling that followed him like a shadow, and at his side, for 25 years, was Clara Grace Sterling. Where Richard was a storm, Clara was a still life. She was beautiful in the way of old money and classical art, poised, elegant, and breathtakingly quiet. She organized his charity galas, managed their sprawling estates in the Hamptons and Aspen, and smiled politely as he accepted awards. To the glittering world of New York high society, she was the perfect accessory, the first lady of the Sterling Empire. Richard loved her for it. He loved her silence, her predictability, her complete lack of ambition. He saw her as his greatest acquisition, beautiful, loyal, and utterly dependent. He had plucked her from a quiet, respectable family, and he had given her the world. In his mind, she was a gentle, slightly dim creature who wouldn't know a stock from a bond. Her days were filled with flowers, charities, and luncheons. He often told his friends, "Clara is a saint, doesn't have a single selfish bone in her body. She just wants to make things beautiful." This perception made his new decision so much easier. The new decision was named Chloe Jensen. Chloe was 29. She was a VP at his firm, all sharp angles, a predatory smile, and an ambition that matched his own. She wasn't beautiful like Clara. She was hot. She challenged him, argued with him in the boardroom, and then tore his clothes off in the back of his Bentley. She was a jolt of electricity, a confirmation that he, Richard Sterling, was still a lion. For 6 months, the affair had been a thrilling, high-stakes game. Chloe wasn't content to be a secret. She wanted the title. She wanted the ring. She wanted to be Mrs. Sterling. "She's old, Richard," Chloe would whisper, her nails tracing his jaw after a brutal day of acquisitions. "She's from another time. You're a shark. You need a shark next to you, not a goldfish." Richard agreed. He was tired of the still life. He wanted the storm. He planned the execution with the same ruthless efficiency he used for a corporate takeover. He would be generous, of course. He wasn't a monster. He'd give Clara the Hamptons house. He preferred Aspen anyway, and a multi-million-dollar lump sum. A stipend, too. Enough for her to continue her quiet, pointless life of flowers and parties. He booked a table at Aurelius, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a public phone number. It was the place he'd proposed to her, a detail he'd long forgotten, but knew she would remember. He thought the sentimentality would soften the blow. He watched her across the table, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple, elegant chignon. She was studying the wine list with mild interest. "Clara," he began, placing his napkin on the table. He hadn't touched his $400 plate of truffle-dusted scallops. She looked up, her blue eyes calm. "Yes, Richard? We've had a wonderful 25 years, a truly remarkable run." Her expression didn't change. She simply waited. This stillness, which he once found comforting, suddenly irritated him. "But people change, Ellie. I've changed. The life we've built, it's not the life I want anymore." He leaned in, adopting the tone of a disappointed father. "I'm in love with someone else. Her name is Chloe Jensen. You've met her at the Christmas party. I'm going to marry her." He paused, waiting for the predictable reaction. The gasp, the tears, the trembling lip, the quiet "how could you?" Clara Sterling did none of those things. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Sancerre. She placed the glass back on the table, her hand perfectly steady. She looked at him, not with pain, but with a faint, almost clinical curiosity. "I see," she said. Her voice was as even as a frozen lake. Richard, thrown off balance, pushed forward. "I've already spoken to my lawyer, Marcus Thorne. He's drawing up the papers. I want to be fair, Clara. I'm prepared to offer you the Hamptons estate, free and clear, and a settlement of, say, $20 million, plus a monthly allowance of $50,000 for life. It's more than generous." He sat back, satisfied. He had been firm, but kind. He was a good man, doing a hard thing. Clara stared at a point just over his shoulder. For a full minute, the only sound was the distant murmur of the restaurant. Finally, she brought her gaze back to his. "Generous. Yes, that's one word for it." "So, we're in agreement?" he asked, relieved. This was easier than he thought. Clara folded her own napkin and placed it on the table. "No, Richard. I don't think we are." "What? It's a fantastic offer. You'll never have to work a day in your—" "I won't be accepting your offer," she interrupted. The steel in her voice was so new it made him flinch. "I also won't be leaving the penthouse, and I certainly won't be giving up Aspen." Richard laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Clara, you don't seem to understand. You don't have a choice. I'm filing for divorce. The assets are in my name. The company is my company. This is my money." Clara looked at him, and for the first time in their marriage, Richard felt a cold prickle of fear. She smiled. It was not a nice smile. "That," she said, rising from the table, "is where you are tragically and completely mistaken." She signaled for the maitre d'. "My coat, please." "Clara, sit down!" Richard hissed, his face reddening. "Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Richard. I'm making a statement." She turned to him, her eyes as cold and clear as diamonds. "You can have your divorce, but you're not divorcing me. I'm divorcing you, and you'll be hearing from my lawyer." "My lawyer, you mean?" he shot back. "I pay all the bills." "No, darling. My lawyer. Her name is Anne Bishop, of Bishop, Knight, and Steiner. You, on the other hand, should probably find new representation. Marcus Thorne works for Sterling Ventures, and as of tomorrow, I'm afraid he'll have a conflict of interest." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper he had to strain to hear. "You see, Richard, you don't pay for anything. You're an employee, and I'm the one who signs your checks." She turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Richard Sterling, for the first time in his life, utterly and completely speechless, his $400 scallops growing cold on the plate. Richard stormed into the offices of his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, the next morning. Marcus was a bulldog, a man who had made corporate raiders weep. He was, in Richard's opinion, the best divorce attorney in New York. "She's bluffing, Marcus," Richard roared, throwing his briefcase onto the leather sofa. "She's delusional. I'm the one who signs your checks. She thinks just because she's my wife, She's my boss. Handle her. Make her see reason." Marcus Thorne, a man who was rarely flustered, looked pale. "She's not bluffing, Richard," Marcus said, his voice grave. "What do you mean?" "It's a simple asset split. I built the company before we were married. She gets a cut of the marital assets. That's it." "No, you didn't," Marcus said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You founded Sterling Capital Partners 2 years before your wedding, but Sterling Ventures, the current holding company, was incorporated 5 years into your marriage. That makes it marital property." "Fine," Richard snapped. "So it's 50-50. I can live with that. I'll buy her out. I'm still the CEO. I'm still the majority shareholder." Marcus held up a hand. "Richard, please, sit down. A courier arrived an hour ago. From Bishop, Knight, and Steiner." He slid a single, crisp document across the vast mahogany desk. It was a letter of representation and a preliminary financial disclosure. "It's a standard form," Richard said, snatching it. "Read the addendum," Marcus said. Richard's eyes scanned the page. Addendum A, list of primary assets, held by Clara Grace Sterling. He read the list, a small laugh escaping his lips. "Well, this is hilarious. She's lost her mind." He read the list aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. 1. Penthouse, 845 Fifth Avenue, sole proprietor. 2. Estate, 1200 Dune Road, Southampton, sole proprietor. 3. Chalet, 45 Starwood Pass, Aspen, sole proprietor. 4. Art collection, Basquiat, Rothko, de Kooning, sole beneficiary of trust. 5. EVS Holdings LLC, sole member. Richard looked up, bewildered. "What is EVS Holdings? I've never heard of it." Marcus leaned forward, his expression funereal. "EVS Holdings, Richard, is the parent company of Sterling Ventures. It owns 95% of the voting stock. The other 5% is owned by the board members, which, by the way, she appointed." The blood drained from Richard's face. He sat down, heavily. "That's impossible," he whispered. That's a clerical error. It has to be. I own my company. I built it." "We've spent the last hour pulling the incorporation documents," Marcus said, his voice flat. "It's no error, Richard. The paperwork is ironclad. EVS Holdings was established 15 years ago. You signed the documents yourself." I would never." Richard's mind was racing, flashing back through 15 years of paperwork, of late nights, of deals. He had signed thousands of documents. "You were in the middle of that hostile takeover of Amax Pharma," Marcus prompted, pulling up another file. "You were being sued by your former partner, David Chen. You were trying to shield your assets from the lawsuit." Richard's eyes widened as the memory, thick and dark, surfaced. "David," he breathed. "He was suing me for half the company. My old lawyer, a guy named Brody, he said we should move the assets, restructure. He suggested you create a new holding company," Marcus continued, reading from Brody's notes, which he'd had subpoenaed from a dusty archive. "A bulletproof entity. He advised you to place it in your wife's name. He called her, let me see, the perfect clean shield. Someone with no business footprint, no outstanding liabilities. Someone who, and I quote, is completely above reproach and utterly uncomplicated." Richard remembered. He remembered it all. The stacks of paper. Clara in her reading glasses, sitting at the kitchen island. "Just sign here, honey," he'd told her, tapping the page. "It's just tax paperwork. Boring legal stuff to protect us from David." "All of them?" she'd asked, gesturing to the 3-inch thick stack. "Every last one. Don't worry your pretty head about the details. That's what I'm for." He had done it. In his arrogance, in his haste to screw over one partner, he had handed the entire kingdom to another. But there was an override, Richard stammered, scrambling for a lifeline. A document, a power of attorney, something that gave me control back. I know Brody drew it up. We can't find it, Richard, Marcus said. We've looked. We've called Brody's old firm. He's retired, living in the Caymans. The file is gone. And Anne Bishop, she claims no such document exists. Richard shot to his feet. Then Clara has it. She's hiding it. She stole it. Or, Marcus said, she destroyed it. Or, maybe in your haste you just forgot to have her sign it. The room tilted. The air was thick and hot. Richard Sterling, the kingmaker, the shark, was drowning. What does this mean? Richard whispered. Marcus Thorne looked his most valuable client in the eye. It means, Richard, that you're not offering her a settlement. It means you're going to have to ask for one. No, Richard said, shaking his head. No, we fight. We go to court. We prove she was just a proxy. We prove this was a temporary arrangement. No judge in the world will believe she runs Sterling Ventures. She organizes parties. I hope you're right, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was anything but. Because Anne Bishop just filed an emergency motion. She's freezing your corporate accounts and your personal credit lines. Richard's phone buzzed. It was an alert from his bank. Credit alert. Your Centurion Black card has been temporarily suspended by the primary account holder. He stared at the message. The primary account holder. EVS Holdings. Clara. She can't do this, he said, his voice a low growl. She just did, Marcus replied. Welcome to the war, Richard. You're starting it with no bullets. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. Richard, a man who could move markets with a phone call, found himself utterly neutered. He went to the office. His keycard, which moments before had granted him access to the 50th floor executive suite, flashed red. Access denied. There must be a mistake, he barked at the security guard, a man he'd nodded to every morning for a decade. The guard, Frank, looked profoundly uncomfortable. Mr. Sterling, sir, I'm under new orders from Ms. Grace Sterling's office. You're not permitted on the executive floor. Ms. Grace Sterling? Richard spat. Her name is Clara Sterling. Now open the damn door, Frank, or you're fired. I can't, sir, Frank said, his hand moving subtly toward his radio. My orders come from from the CEO. I am the CEO, Richard roared. The lobby, usually a quiet hum of activity, went silent. Everyone was watching. Not according to this memo, sir, Frank said, holding up a piece of paper from a newly installed printer behind the desk. It was on crisp, linen letterhead Richard had never seen before. 2. All staff. Sterling Ventures. From Clara Grace Sterling, Chairwoman and CEO, EVS. Holdings date, November 8, 2025. Leadership transition. Effective immediately. Richard Sterling is on a mandatory leave of absence and is no longer an officer of this company. He holds no operational authority. All queries are to be directed to the new acting COO, Mr. Julian Hayes. Julian Hayes. Julian Hayes. A man Richard had personally poached from a rival, a man he'd mentored, a man he'd had over for dinner. A traitor. Humiliated, Richard retreated to the street. He tried to call his driver. The call went straight to voicemail. He pulled out his phone to order an Uber, only to remember his credit cards were frozen. He, Richard Sterling, worth an estimated $2 billion on paper, was forced to hail a yellow cab. He went to the penthouse. The doorman, a man to whom he'd given a $5,000 Christmas bonus, stopped him. Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling. I'm afraid I can't let you up. Don't be ridiculous, Thomas. It's my home. "Mrs. Sterling's lawyers sent over instructions, sir. The property is in her name only. She has requested privacy. They've already had the locks changed." Richard was locked out of his office. He was locked out of his home. He was left with one option. He took the cab to the only place he could, Chloe Jensen's sleek, modern and, he suddenly, sickeningly realized, company-leased apartment in Tribeca. He found her frantically packing. "Richard, thank God," she said, her eyes wide with panic. "What is going on? My corporate card was declined. They've suspended my email. They're calling an emergency board meeting, and I'm not on the invite list." "It's Clara," Richard said, collapsing onto her white suede couch. She's done something. A legal trick. She's claiming she owns the company." Chloe stopped packing and stared at him. "Claiming? Richard, is it true?" "It's a misunderstanding. A clerical error from years ago. I'll fix it. Marcus is on it. We'll go to court. We'll prove I'm the one who built everything. I need a place to stay for a few days, and I need you to be with me. We're a team, remember?" Chloe looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't see adoration or ambition. He saw calculation, a rat assessing a sinking ship. "A clerical error?" she repeated. "Richard, I just got a call from Julian Hayes. He said Clara has been the sole signatory on every major acquisition for the last 15 years. He said you were just the operations guy. He said your employment was at will." "He's lying," Richard yelled. "He's trying to save his own skin. She signed what I told her to sign." "Did she?" Chloe asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Or did you just assume she did?" "Richard, you told me you were the king. You told me you owned everything. You promised me the Hamptons house. You promised me everything. And you'll get it," he pleaded, a pathetic tone creeping into his voice that he despised. "We just have to fight this." Chloe turned back to her suitcase. She zipped it, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. "I can't, Richard," she said, not looking at him. "I've worked too hard to get where I am. I'm not going to be dragged down with you." "Dragged down? I made you. I plucked you from obscurity." "And I'm grateful," she said, her voice cold. "But you're not the man I thought you were. The man I was with, he was powerful. He was in control. You're a guest. You got kicked out of your own house by your wife. I can't be with a man like that." She picked up her bag and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "To a hotel, and then tomorrow I'm going to call Julian Hayes and beg for my job. You should probably go. The lease on this apartment is in the company's name. I imagine your key will stop working soon, too." She left. Richard Sterling was alone, in an apartment that was no longer his, with no money, no home, and no allies. The empire he had built, or thought he had built, had vanished in less than 3 days. He finally understood. This wasn't a bluff. This was a coup d'etat, and it had been planned, not for days, but for decades. The deposition was set for 2 weeks later. Richard spent that time in a grim, sterile suite at the Marriott, paid for by a loan from his lawyer, Marcus, who was now working on contingency. The humiliation was a physical, choking presence. He was a lion in a cage, and he was furious. "She won't show," Richard insisted to Marcus on the morning of the deposition. "She'll send Anne Bishop. She won't have the nerve to face me." "She'll be here, Richard," Marcus said. "This isn't about nerve. This is about execution." They sat in a sterile conference room. Richard, in his one remaining good suit, felt like an imposter. At 10:00 a.m. on the dot, the door opened. Anne Bishop, a woman who looked like she ate hostile witnesses for breakfast, walked in, and behind her was Clara. But it was not the Clara he knew. The quiet, beige and pearl-wearing homemaker was gone. This woman was wearing a charcoal grey Tom Ford pantsuit that screamed authority. Her hair was not in its soft, matronly chignon. It was cut into a sharp, severe bob. Her only jewellery was a steel Patek Philippe watch. She looked like the women Richard used to compete against. She looked formidable. She sat down opposite him, her face impassive. She did not look at him. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus began, his voice attempting a familiar, reasonable tone. "We're here to clear up what seems to be a significant misunderstanding." "Ms. Grace Sterling," Anne Bishop corrected him, "and there is no misunderstanding." "Right," Marcus said, shuffling papers. "Let's talk about EVS Holdings. Ms. Grace Sterling, when Mr. Sterling set up this company 15 years ago, what was your understanding of its purpose?" Clara finally looked at Marcus. Her voice was clear and cool. Its purpose was to act as the primary holding entity for all corporate assets, to shield them from frivolous litigation, and to serve as the central command for all capital allocation and long-term strategy. Richard almost laughed. "She's reading a script. That's legal jargon. Ask her what capital allocation means." Anne Bishop smiled thinly. "Please direct your questions to the witness, counsel, and not to your client." Marcus regrouped. "Ms. Grace Sterling, what is your educational background?" "She went to a finishing school in Switzerland," Richard muttered, loud enough for the stenographer to hear. "I have a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Vassar College," Clara stated calmly, "and an MBA from the Wharton School of Business with a dual concentration in finance and strategic management." The room went silent. Richard's blood turned to ice. He stared at his wife of 25 years. "What?" he whispered. You told me," he stammered. "You told me you went to Vassar for art history." "You heard Vassar and art history," Clara corrected him, finally turning her cold eyes on him. "You never actually asked. You just assumed. It was easier for you to see me that way. It made you feel bigger." Marcus Thorne was pale. This was no longer a divorce proceeding. This was an ambush. "So," Marcus continued, his voice strained, "with this extensive background, you were a willing participant in the corporate structure." "I designed it," Clara said. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. "Brody, my lawyer, he designed it," Richard insisted. "Mr. Brody was a tax attorney," Clara said, a hint of disdain in her voice. "He handled the filing, the structure, the blind trusts, the offshore accounts, the layered ownership to protect against a hostile takeover or a partner dispute. That was my design. I presented it to him. I presented it to you, Richard." She turned to him again. "You just didn't read it. You were too busy." Marcus, desperate, tried a new tack. "But you were not involved in the day-to-day operations. Mr. Sterling ran the company. He made the deals. He was the CEO." "Richard was an excellent COO," Clara agreed. "He's a brilliant, ruthless negotiator. He was the face of the brand, the rainmaker. He managed the operations. My job was to manage the assets. He made the deals. I approved the financing. He found the companies to buy. I signed the checks to acquire them." "There's no proof of that," Richard yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "Actually," Anne Bishop said, sliding a thick, bound volume across the table, "there is." Marcus opened it. It was 15 years of emails from Richard's own account. "Ellie, attached is the Amax deal. Need your signature on the funding wire. Brody says it's standard. Honey, Julian Hayes's compensation package is attached. Let me know you've approved it, so I can send the offer. E, The board resolution for the new Aspen property. Please sign and return. I've got the jet waiting." On and on it went. Hundreds of emails, each one a request, each one in legal terms an employee seeking approval from his superior. He had, in his haste and arrogance, created a 15-year, irrefutable paper trail of his own subordination. He thought he was giving her to-do lists. He was, in fact, asking for permission. You were a ghost," Richard whispered, staring at the pages. "You were in the machine the whole time." "I was never a ghost, Richard," Clara said, rising. "You just chose to be blind. You saw what you wanted to see. A quiet, simple wife who worshipped you." She leaned over the table. "The truth is, I was the one who built the castle. You were just the loudest knight I allowed to live in it. And your services," she said, her voice dropping to a merciless whisper, "are no longer required." The deposition destroyed Richard's case. Marcus Thorne, for all his bluster, was a divorce lawyer, not a corporate litigator. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. "She's got us, Richard," Marcus said, back in the Marriott suite. The minibar was empty. "She has the documents. She has the paper trail. She has the education. A judge won't see this as a clerical error. They'll see it as a brilliantly executed, long-term business arrangement." "So what? I was still her husband. I get half of everything." "No," Marcus said. "You don't. You get half of the marital assets. And she's structured the empire so that there are no marital assets. The penthouse, the cars, the art. The penthouse, the houses, and the art are all owned by EVS Holdings," Marcus explained, his voice weary. "They are corporate assets, not a family home. The cars are leased by the company. The jet is a fractional ownership held by the trust. The only things in your name, Richard, are a 2022 Lexus LS, which the company will likely claim is an employee vehicle, and your personal checking account, which, after she froze your access, has a balance of $28,000. Richard stared at him. 28,000. She also, quite cleverly, paid all your personal credit cards from the corporate account. This means you have no personal credit history and no debt, but also no assets. The only jointly held property is a checking account with your wife that you haven't used in a decade. It contains $15,600. Richard was, for the first time in his life, poor. "So I get half of $15,600? he asked, his voice cracking. "Technically, yes, $7,800. Plus whatever a judge decides is fair severance for a long-term employee." Richard threw a glass against the wall. "I am not an employee." "You are," Marcus said, "and she's firing you. Anne Bishop just sent over the final offer. It's for cause." "For cause? What cause?" "She's citing gross financial misconduct and attempted fraudulent conveyance." "What the hell is that?" "She's claiming your attempt to divorce her and steal $20 million of her company's assets via a fraudulent settlement constitutes an attempt to defraud the primary shareholder. It's brilliant, actually. She's not just divorcing you. She's suing you." This was the end. Richard knew it. The lion was not just caged, he was skinned. He had one last, desperate card to play. Not a legal card, but a personal one. He found her. He waited outside the EVS Holdings building, his building, for hours, a pathetic figure in a rumpled suit. When she emerged, flanked by 2 new security guards, he ran to her. "Clara, Ellie, please!" The guards moved to intercept him, but she held up a hand. She looked at him, with the same detached pity one might give a beggar on the street. "What do you want, Richard?" "Why?" he pleaded, all his rage and arrogance gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of confusion. 25 years. I know I messed up. I know about Chloe. I'm sorry. I was a fool. But it's monstrous. To take everything. After I gave you everything? Clara stepped closer to him. Her eyes were not angry. They were tired. You think this is about Chloe? She asked, a small, sad laugh escaping her. Oh, Richard, you're so predictable. Chloe is just a symptom. She's the third one I've known about. Do you think I'm stupid? He flinched. This isn't about your infidelity, she continued, her voice low. This is about your contempt. You didn't just cheat on me, Richard. You erased me. You told your friends I was a saint. You told our children I was fragile. You told me not to worry my pretty head about the boring paperwork. Her voice grew harder. You gave me nothing. I took what I was owed. The moment you handed me that stack of papers to hide your assets from David Chen. That was the moment you gave me the sword. You were so busy being clever, you never imagined I was smart. But we were happy, he whispered. I loved you. You loved the idea of me, she said. You loved a mirror that reflected how big and strong you were. The real me, the Wharton MBA, the woman who ran your entire financial back end, the woman who tripled your net worth while you were busy playing golf and entertaining mistresses. You would have hated that woman. She would have threatened you. She straightened her jacket. So I let you have your illusion. I played the part of the perfect simple wife. I let you think you were the king. It was a business arrangement. You gave me a comfortable life, and I made you a billionaire. And now, the arrangement is over. So what now? He asked, his shoulders slumped. I'm ruined. I have nothing. You have $28,000 and a Lexus, she said, without an ounce of pity. You're a self-made man, Richard. Go make yourself again. She turned and walked to the waiting Bentley, her Bentley. Clara, wait, he called out, one last desperate cry. What about us? What about 25 years? She paused at the door of the car. She looked back at him, the noise of the city fading around them. You were right, Richard, she said. We did have a wonderful run. You were the best COO I ever could have hired, but as a husband, you were a catastrophic liability. She got in the car. It pulled into traffic and disappeared. Richard Sterling was left alone on the sidewalk, a ghost in the city he once owned. The courtroom was a tomb. It wasn't a high-profile media circus. Anne Bishop had seen to that, filing motions to seal the most salacious financial details, arguing that EVS Holdings was a private corporation whose trade secrets were not public fodder. But a few finance reporters and courtroom sketch artists had caught the scent. They sat in the back row, sniffing out the spectacular, quiet implosion of a titan. Richard Sterling sat at the defendant's table, a man hollowed out. The 2 weeks since the deposition had ravaged him. His remaining good suit, the one he'd worn to the disastrous meeting with Marcus, hung on his frame. His skin had a grey, papery quality. He was represented by a young, visibly nervous public defender named Mr. Calloway, who had been assigned the case after Marcus Thorne had formally, and very publicly, withdrawn, citing an irreparable conflict of interest and a client who was now officially indigent. On the other side, Clara Grace Sterling sat in an oasis of calm. She was flanked by Anne Bishop and a trio of junior partners from Bishop, Knight and Steiner. They were a phalanx of dark blue suits and quiet competence. Clara herself wore a dress of deep burgundy, a colour of muted power. She looked, Richard thought with a dull pang of shock, 10 years younger. The burden of being his perfect wife had apparently been a heavy one. She did not look at him. Not once. The trial, if one could call it that, was a brutal formality. Anne Bishop spoke for 20 minutes, her voice a calm, slicing instrument. She laid out the timeline, the incorporation of EVS Holdings, the clear and unbroken 15-year chain of command, and the operational role Mr. Sterling had held as a high-level, well-compensated employee. Mr. Calloway, bless his heart, tried. He stammered about spousal privilege, implied partnership, and unjust enrichment. He tried to paint a picture of a trusting husband duped by a conniving wife. "Your Honor," Calloway argued, his voice cracking slightly, "Mr. Sterling built this company. It was his genius, his labor. Mrs. Sterling, Ms. Grace Sterling, was a homemaker. She planned parties. To allow this legal trickery to stand would be to make a mockery of the marital contract." When he finished, there was a heavy silence. Judge Maria Kessinger, a woman renowned for her impatience with theatrics, looked at him over the top of her spectacles. "Legal trickery, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, her voice dangerously mild. "Are you referring to the Wharton MBA Ms. Grace Sterling holds? Or the 15-year paper trail of every single financial decision she personally approved? Which part, exactly, is the trick?" Calloway sat down. Judge Kessinger turned her attention to the sheaf of papers in front of her. She didn't need to deliberate. The case was, as Anne Bishop had promised, ironclad. "I have reviewed the extensive, and I must say, exhaustive documentation provided by both sides," Judge Kessinger began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I have read the deposition of Mr. Sterling and the deposition of Ms. Grace Sterling. The facts of this case are not in dispute. What is in dispute is Mr. Sterling's perception of those facts." She looked directly at Richard. He shrank under her gaze. "Mr. Sterling, your entire case rests on the premise that this court should ignore 2 decades of legally binding contracts, corporate filings, and financial records, and instead rule based on your feelings. You claim you were unaware of what you were signing. You claim you were tricked into giving your wife control of your company." She leaned forward. "This court finds that claim not only baseless, but, frankly, preposterous. You are, by all accounts, a notoriously ruthless and sophisticated businessman. You personally orchestrated the creation of EVS Holdings for the specific purpose of shielding your assets from a former partner, Mr. David Chen. You cannot create a legal fortress to protect yourself, and then, when it no longer suits you, claim you didn't know you were building it." She shuffled a paper. "Your counsel argues for the court to pierce the corporate veil, to see EVS Holdings as a sham entity that is indistinguishable from your marital assets. The irony is lost on no one, I'm sure. But Ms. Grace Sterling has provided overwhelming evidence that the corporation was, and is, a legitimate, functioning entity. She ran it. She directed its finances. She was the final authority. You were, as her counsel so accurately stated, her chief negotiator. A very, very well-paid one, I might add. The veil holds." Richard's hands, hidden under the table, were shaking. "Now," the judge continued, "let us move to the specific matters at hand. On the matter of the divorce, the petition is granted on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. The marriage between Richard Sterling and Clara Grace Sterling is hereby dissolved." Richard felt nothing. That battle had been lost weeks ago. On the matter of asset division, this court finds that there are virtually no marital assets to divide. The properties in New York, the Hamptons, and Aspen along with all art, vehicles, and the Gulfstream jet, are the clear and sole property of the corporation EVS Holdings. They were never marital property. They were corporate assets, which you, Mr. Sterling, were permitted to use as part of your compensation package. The only jointly held asset identified by this court, she went on, is a First National checking account ending in 4492, which has a balance of $15,600. The court orders this asset to be divided equally. Mr. Sterling will be awarded $7,800. A sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped Richard's lips. The sketch artists in the back began to draw furiously. On the matter of spousal support, Mr. Sterling has petitioned for alimony, citing a significant change in lifestyle. The court denies this petition. Ms. Grace Sterling's wealth is derived from her private corporation, not from Mr. Sterling. If anything, his wealth was derived from her. He is an able-bodied, highly educated man. The court expects him to find new employment. The final nail. Judge Kessinger picked up the last paper. On the matter of Mr. Sterling's employment, this court upholds the for-cause termination enacted by the EVS Holdings Board. The claim of gross financial misconduct is well-founded. Mr. Sterling, in his initial divorce filing, attempted to offer his wife a $20 million settlement. This was, in effect, an attempt to use his operational position to extract $20 million from a company he did not own. That is, by definition, attempted fraudulent conveyance. He is not, therefore, entitled to a severance package, a golden parachute, or any stock options, which, by the way, he never had. She closed the file. The sound was like a gunshot. In summary, Judge Kessinger concluded, her eyes boring into Richard, you didn't lose your company in this divorce, Mr. Sterling. You are simply, for the first time, being forced to acknowledge that you never owned it. You used your wife as a legal shield, believing her to be a passive, unintelligent prop. You assumed her silence was ignorance. That was not a clerical error. That was a catastrophic misjudgment of character. You chose to be willfully blind. The law does not exist to protect men from their own arrogance. This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked. It was over. Reporters scrambled out of the room. Anne Bishop touched Clara's arm, a small, congratulatory gesture. Clara simply nodded, her face serene. Richard just sat there. He was a statue of ash. $7,800. He owed Marcus Thorne almost $500,000. He was worth less than nothing. He was a joke. Mr. Calloway patted his shoulder. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. We can look at an appeal, but... Richard didn't hear him. He was watching Clara. She stood up, gathered her files, and began to walk toward the exit. Her path took her directly past the defendant's table. He looked up as she approached, his eyes hollow and pleading. He was no longer a king. He was a beggar. He was looking for something, a flicker of remorse, a hint of pity, a shadow of the woman he had married, or the woman who had once, he knew, loved him. There was nothing. Her eyes were as calm and clear as the Caribbean Sea. She was a stranger. She paused just for a second. The last of the lawyers was filtering out, leaving the three of them, Richard, Clara, and the baffled Mr. Calloway, in the cavernous, silent room. Clara reached into her leather briefcase. She took out a small white envelope. It was from her personal bank, he noted with a detached sense of irony. Not the corporate account. She slid it across the polished wood table. It stopped directly in front of his trembling hands. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking with sharp, final authority on the marble floor. Richard stared at the envelope. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to open it. He expected a note, a letter, a final twist of the knife. It was a check. It was drawn from her personal account, and made out to Richard Sterling. The amount was for $50,000. He almost wept with a sick, pathetic sense of relief. It was something. It was enough. Enough to disappear. Enough to start. Something. Maybe she did care. Maybe this was her one small act of mercy. Then his eyes drifted to the memo line in the bottom left corner. 2 words written in her elegant, familiar script. Severance pay. In New York, a void is filled as quickly as it is created. The spectacular implosion of Richard Sterling was a 9-day wonder, a delicious piece of high society gossip that was quickly replaced by the next scandal. But the rise of Clara Grace Sterling was a story with legs. 1 year later, the cover of Forbes magazine, dated November 2026, did not feature a man. It featured Clara. She stood not in a penthouse, but on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, her sharp bob perfectly in place, her expression calm and authoritative. The headline blazed in bold white font. The Queen of Wall Street, how Clara Grace Sterling took her empire public and became the richest self-made woman in America. The article was a masterpiece of controlled narrative. It detailed the brilliant internal restructuring of the company, now rebranded as Grace Global. It spoke of the wildly successful IPO that had tripled the firm's valuation. Analysts, who had once credited the company's success to Richard's rainmaker persona, now praised Clara's quiet, laser-focused financial strategy, calling her the true genius behind the curtain. The article celebrated her as a new icon, a woman who had patiently waited for her moment. Richard Sterling was mentioned only once, in a single, brutal sentence. Grace Global's IPO followed the 4 cause removal of its former COO, and Ms. Sterling's ex-husband, Richard Sterling, for gross financial misconduct. The $50,000 severance pay had been a final, calculated insult. After satisfying a fraction of the crushing legal debt he owed Marcus Thorne, Richard was left with just enough to secure a lease on a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in Yonkers. The man who once commuted via helicopter now rode the Metro North when he had a reason to. He tried to find work. He was, after all, Richard Sterling. But the financial world is small, and its memory is long. His story was too good, too brutal, to remain a secret. He was a pariah. No one would hire a man who had been so publicly, so completely outsmarted. He wasn't just a bad investment. He was a walking punchline. He was the fool who had been fired by his wife, the king who had been checkmated by his ornament. Chloe Jensen, having no corporate veil to hide behind, fared no better. Branded as the mistress of a failed usurper, she was last seen working in marketing for a mid-level insurance firm in Hackensack, New Jersey, her ambitions reduced to a 401k. Richard Sterling, meanwhile, was a ghost. He was a cautionary tale whispered at the high-stakes poker games he used to host. On a rainy Tuesday night, he sat at the bar of a nameless Irish pub in Midtown, nursing a well whiskey. He was just another face in the after-work crowd. The television above the bar was on a financial news network. Suddenly, the chatter faded. There she was, Clara. She was on screen, being interviewed about Grace Global's quarterly earnings, which had, once again, shattered expectations. She was poised, brilliant, and utterly in command. Richard stared at her image, the glass frozen halfway to his lips. He looked, the bartender noted to a regular, like a man who had just seen a ghost. But he wasn't seeing a ghost. He was seeing the woman who had been there all along. He had built an empire to protect himself from his enemies, never once realizing the only person he needed to fear was the one he slept next to. He thought he was a king, but he was just the loudest fool in the court, and in the end he wasn't brought down by a rival shark, but by the goldfish he'd kept in a bowl, forgetting that, given enough time, the right motivation, and a Wharton MBA, any creature will grow teeth. The story of Richard and Clara Sterling is a brutal lesson in assumption. He saw his wife as an ornament, a passive part of his life, and that mistake cost him everything. She played the long game, using his own arrogance as her greatest weapon. It's a chilling reminder that the people we underestimate are often the ones holding the cards. What do you think? Was Clara a mastermind who delivered cold, calculated justice? Or was her 25-year deception as much of a betrayal as his infidelity? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is wild, and I want to hear what you think. If you love these kinds of real-life dramas and shocking twists, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good revenge story. And most importantly, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the next story we uncover. Thanks for listening.